Part 1. The wedding that was supposed to be perfect English version. It was supposed to be the most beautiful day of my son's life. That a wedding is never just a ceremony in a family. It is a symbol, a beginning, a promise that two lives are joining, and that everything broken in the past will somehow be made whole again. At least, that's what I believed when I woke up that morning. The sun was already bright over the outskirts of the city. The wedding venue sat on a private estate surrounded by tall oak trees and carefully trimmed gardens. White ribbons hung from every archway. Rows of chairs were aligned perfectly on the green lawn, facing a floral altar that looked like something out of a magazine. My wife, Helen, stood beside me in the mirror as I adjusted my tie. "You look nervous," she said softly, smoothing the wrinkles on my sleeve. "I'm not nervous," I replied, though my voice didn't sound convincing even to myself. "I'm just proud." And I meant it. Our son, Daniel, had worked hard to build his life. After years of struggle, late nights, and sacrifices, he had finally found stability. And today, he was marrying the woman he said he loved. We had waited for this day for a long time. Too long, maybe. Helen reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "She'll be family soon," she said. "We should be happy." I nodded, but something inside me stayed unsettled. Not fear exactly. Not doubt either. Just a quiet hesitation. I couldn't explain that. We arrived at the venue just before noon. The parking lot was already filling with luxury cars. Guests in expensive dresses and tailored suits walked toward the entrance, laughing softly, holding champagne glasses that sparkled under the sun. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Inside, the wedding coordinator greeted us with a practiced smile. "Mr. Carter, Mrs. Carter, welcome," she said warmly. "Everything is ready. The ceremony will begin at 2 sharp." Helen smiled politely. I nodded. But as we walked deeper into the venue, I began to notice small things. The way conversation stopped for half a second when we passed. The way some guests glanced at us, then looked away too quickly. And then I saw her my daughter-in-law, or rather, the woman who would soon become my daughter-in-law, Samantha. She stood near the floral arch, dressed in an elegant white robe while speaking to one of the photographers. Her smile was flawless, too flawless. It didn't reach her eyes. When she saw us approaching, she immediately changed direction and walked toward us. "Mr. Carter," she said brightly, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "You made it early." Her voice was sweet, carefully sweet, like sugar dissolved in something sharper underneath. "Of course," I replied. "It's my son's wedding." "Yes," she said, smiling a little too widely. "Of course it is." Something about the way she said it made Helen shift slightly beside me, but I ignored it because weddings make people emotional. And I didn't want to imagine problems where there were none. Not today. The guests continued arriving. Music played softly through hidden speakers in the garden. A string quartet rehearsed in the distance. The air smelled like roses and fresh grass. Helen and I took our seats near the front row reserved for family. I remember looking at the empty aisle and thinking about how Daniel used to walk beside me as a child. Small hands gripping mine tightly, asking endless questions about everything he saw. Now he would walk down that same aisle as a grown man, and I would watch him start a new life without me at the center of it. That thought should have felt painful, but instead, it felt peaceful, like something completing its natural cycle. But peace never lasts long. When something is wrong beneath the surface. It started with small things. That a whispered laugh behind us, a guest glancing at Helen, then quickly looking away. A staff member hesitating before speaking to us. And then the comment I almost didn't hear, "She really thinks she belongs here?" It came from somewhere behind the second row. Helen stiffened slightly. I turned my head slowly, but the people behind us were already smiling politely, as if nothing had been said. Still, something inside me shifted. Not anger. Awareness. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. Guests began moving toward their seats. The music changed. The atmosphere shifted into expectation. And that's when I noticed something strange. Helen wasn't being greeted like family. Not properly. Not warmly. She was being observed, like someone trying to decide where she fit in the picture. I leaned slightly toward her. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded, but her fingers tightened around her purse. "I'm fine," she said. "It's just a lot of people." I believed her, or I wanted to. Then Samantha returned. This time, she was no longer smiling. Not fully, Her eyes scanned Helen from head to toe before landing on her shoes. There was a pause, just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. And in that pause, something unspoken passed through her expression, judgment, or worse, disapproval. "You might want to stay near your seat after the ceremony," Samantha said casually. Helen blinked. "Of course," she replied gently. But Samantha had already turned away, and I remember thinking, that was an odd thing to say at a wedding. The orchestra began tuning their instruments. Guests stood. Phones came out. The moment was approaching. But instead of excitement, I started feeling something else building in my chest, a quiet discomfort. Not loud enough to name, but impossible to ignore. Helen leaned slightly toward me. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. "Feel what?" She hesitated. "Like, we're not being welcomed." "Exactly." I didn't answer immediately, because part of me had already started noticing it too, and I didn't like what that meant. The doors at the far end of the garden opened. The bridal march was about to begin. Everyone stood, and in that moment, right before everything officially started, I looked at my wife beside me. Helen looked calm, but I could see it now, the small tension in her shoulders. The way her eyes scanned the room instead of focusing forward, like she was preparing for something she didn't yet understand. And I realized something I didn't want to admit. This wedding wasn't just about my son. Something else was happening here. Something underneath the smiles, underneath the music, underneath the perfect flowers and perfect lighting. Something I hadn't been invited to see yet. And I had a feeling I was about to find out exactly what it was. The ceremony was getting closer. Guests were now fully seated. The soft sound of conversation faded into a respectful silence as the string quartet began playing the opening notes of the bridal march. Everything was supposed to be perfect in this moment. But perfection, I was beginning to understand, is often just a mask. Helen leaned slightly toward me again. "I don't like how they're looking at us," she whispered. I didn't answer right away, because I had started noticing it too. The looks weren't random anymore. They were intentional, calculated, like we were guests who had somehow entered the wrong room. Before I could respond, Samantha appeared again. This time, she wasn't smiling at all. Her heels clicked softly against the marble walkway as she approached our row. "Mr. Carter," she said, stopping directly in front of me. "A small request." I raised my eyes. "Yes." Her gaze flicked briefly to Helen, then back to me. "We've arranged seating for after the ceremony. It would be better if your wife stays near the back area during the reception." The words didn't register immediately, not because I didn't hear them, but because my mind refused to accept them at first. Helen blinked. "I'm sorry," she said gently. Samantha smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "It's just logistics. We have media coverage, photographers, important guests. We're trying to keep the front area organized." Organized. That word hit harder than I expected. Helen slowly nodded, but I could see her hands tightening around her purse again. "I understand," she said softly. But I didn't understand. Not even slightly. I looked at Samantha. "Are you saying my wife cannot sit with family?" Her smile didn't change. "I'm saying it would be more appropriate for her to stay in the designated guest section." There it was. Not confusion. Not misunderstanding. A decision. A deliberate one. The air between us felt heavier. Helen touched my arm gently. "It's fine," she whispered. "Don't make a scene today." That sentence hurt more than anything Samantha had said, because it meant Helen had already accepted her place in this structure. A place I did not recognize. Samantha turned away as if the conversation was finished. But I wasn't finished. Not internally. Something in me had shifted. A quiet pressure building behind my ribs. The kind that doesn't explode, but settles in slowly, permanently. I watched her walk away, then looked around. That's when I noticed it clearly. The separation. Families of guests were sitting together, laughing, taking photos. But Helen and I were subtly isolated. Not physically removed, but emotionally placed on the edge of everything. Like we were present, but not included. The music shifted again. A signal. The ceremony was about to begin. Guests stood. Phones rose. A wave of anticipation moved through the crowd. But instead of excitement, I felt something colder forming in my stomach. Helen exhaled slowly beside me. "I just want this to go smoothly," she said. I nodded. So did I? But I also realized something else. Smoothly was no longer an option. Not anymore. The doors opened at the far end of the garden. A hush fell instantly. The bride had not yet appeared, but the moment had already begun to tighten around us like a wire. And in that silence, I became acutely aware of something I had missed earlier. The staff. The way they avoided eye contact with Helen. The way one of them hesitated before placing a program card in her hands. The subtle distance. Not obvious enough to confront, but too consistent to ignore. Helen leaned closer again. "Do you feel like something is wrong?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, because answering that question meant admitting something I wasn't ready to say out loud. "Yes," I finally said. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked forward, toward the aisle. "I've been trying to ignore it," she admitted. "But I feel like I'm in the wrong place today." That sentence stayed with me. Wrong place. At my own son's wedding. The bridal music began. The first notes of the march filled the garden. Guests stood fully now. Everything was set. And yet, I couldn't focus on the bride's entrance. My attention kept drifting back to Helen. The way she sat so still. The way she wasn't being greeted. The way she was being watched instead of welcomed. And I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't just about Samantha. This was about structure, control, positioning, who belonged where, and who didn't. The bride had not even stepped into view yet. But the real ceremony, the real dynamic, had already started long before the music began. And we were already positioned inside it. Not as participants, but as something else. Something tolerated. Helen squeezed my hand once. A small gesture, almost apologetic. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "let's just get through today." I looked at her, and for the first time that morning, I didn't nod immediately, because I wasn't sure I wanted to get through something I no longer understood. The music rose. The doors at the end of the aisle began to open wider, and I realized whatever was about to happen next was not going to be part of the wedding I thought I was attending. The music changed. The doors at the end of the aisle opened wider, and everyone stood. But I wasn't watching the bride anymore. I was watching my wife. Helen sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her lap, fingers lightly trembling. She wasn't looking at the bride either. She was scanning the room, slowly, carefully, as if she had finally begun to understand something she didn't want to accept. Something about this moment didn't feel like celebration. It felt like positioning, like we were being placed somewhere inside a story we hadn't agreed to be part of. Then I saw him, my son Daniel, standing at the front, smiling. But it wasn't the smile I remembered from years ago. Not the boy who used to run into my arms after school. Not the young man who once asked me for advice on everything from work to love. This smile was controlled, carefully maintained, as if he had practiced it. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and then moved away. That was the first time I felt it clearly. Not confusion, not disappointment, but distance. A distance that had already been decided long before today. The bride began her walk down the aisle. Guests smiled, some even wiped tears. But I barely saw her, because something else was happening beside me. Helen leaned slightly closer. "I don't think I belong here," she whispered. The words hit harder than I expected, because she didn't sound angry. She sounded certain, like she had finally accepted a truth that had been building all morning. I turned toward her. "What are you talking about?" I asked quietly. She hesitated, then looked down at her hands. "I think they've already decided where I fit," she said. I didn't answer immediately, because I realized I had been thinking the same thing, but I hadn't dared to say it out loud. Samantha stood near the front again, watching, not the bride, not the ceremony, but us. That's when I understood something I should have seen earlier. This wasn't disorganization. This wasn't social awkwardness. This was design. Every seat, every glance, every pause in conversation. It had all been arranged. Not loudly, not obviously, but precisely, like a system, and we were not placed at the center of it. The ceremony continued. Vows were spoken. Applause followed. But none of it reached me anymore. My attention had shifted fully to what was happening around us. A guest nearby leaned toward another and whispered something. They both looked at Helen, then quickly looked away. Another couple stopped talking when I glanced in their direction. It was subtle, but undeniable. We were being observed, evaluated, measured, not as family, but as something else, something lesser. Helen exhaled slowly. "I've been trying to ignore it all morning," she said softly. "But I can't anymore." I looked at her. Her eyes were calm, but there was something breaking underneath the calm, like a realization she had carried too long alone. "What exactly can't you ignore?" I asked. She hesitated, then spoke quietly. "That we are not being welcomed. We are being tolerated." The words stayed in the air between us. Heavy, final, And for the first time, I didn't try to correct her. Because I couldn't. The ceremony reached its emotional peak. The bride and groom stood together. Applause filled the garden. But I noticed something else. Samantha didn't clap. She was still watching us, as if waiting for something or someone. And I suddenly understood. This wasn't just about seating. It was about control, about message, about showing us exactly where we stood in this family structure, and making sure we understood it too. Helen touched my hand gently. I don't want to stay for the reception, she said. Her voice was quiet, but steady. That surprised me more than anything else that morning. I turned toward her fully. What do you mean? She looked at me now, directly, for the first time that day. I mean, I don't think we are part of this family picture anymore. A silence followed. Not loud, but absolute. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. Slowly, deeply. Not anger yet. Not action. But clarity. A kind of clarity that comes when denial finally stops working. I looked toward the front again. My son was still there, smiling. But now I saw it differently. Not as happiness, but as separation. A line had already been drawn, and we were standing on the wrong side of it. The applause faded. The ceremony ended. Guests began to move. But Helen didn't stand immediately. Neither did I, because for the first time, I wasn't following the moment anymore. I was questioning it. All of it. And I knew, whatever came next was no longer about a wedding. It was about truth, and who had been excluded from it. The ceremony ended, but I barely noticed it. Applause rose again. People stood, hugged, smiled, took photos. The world around us shifted into celebration mode. But inside me, something had already moved in a different direction. Helen remained seated for a few seconds longer. Then slowly, she stood up. Not with hesitation, but with finality. I want to leave, she said quietly. I nodded. Because I did too. As we walked away from the ceremony area, I noticed how quickly the atmosphere changed behind us. The music returned. The laughter resumed. The wedding continued as if nothing had happened. As if we had never been part of it. But silence followed us instead. Heavy, unspoken, and absolute. Helen walked slightly ahead of me, holding her purse tightly. I could see her shoulders weren't shaking. She wasn't crying, but she was different. Something had closed inside her. A door she had kept open for a long time. And now it was finally shutting. We reached a quieter part of the estate, near a small stone path lined with trees. She stopped walking. So did I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Helen broke the silence. I've been trying to convince myself this was just stress, she said. Wedding pressure. Young people being careless. She shook her head slightly. But it wasn't, was it? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was forming in my mind too. Slowly, uncomfortably, clearly. No, I said finally. It wasn't. She exhaled, like she had been holding that breath all morning. I kept thinking maybe I misunderstood things, she said. The looks, the comments, the way they placed us. I thought maybe I was being sensitive. She looked at me now. But you saw it too. It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. And I nodded. For a moment, we just stood there. Two people outside a celebration that was still happening without us. And then something unexpected surfaced in my mind. A memory. Not from today, but from months ago. A dinner at our house. Samantha sitting across the table, smiling politely, asking questions about finances, about assets, about future planning. At the time, I thought it was normal curiosity. Family conversations. But now I saw it differently. She hadn't been learning about us. She had been measuring us. Another memory came. Daniel mentioning casually that Samantha wanted a more structured family environment. I remembered laughing, thinking it was just her personality. But now I understood, it wasn't personality. It was control, organization, placement. Who belonged where, and who didn't. Helen suddenly spoke again. Do you remember when she asked me if I still needed to sit at the main table during holidays? I turned toward her. Yes, I said slowly. At the time, I had dismissed it. A harmless comment. But now it echoed differently, like a warning I had failed to hear. Helen's voice lowered. I think she's been deciding where I fit into this family for a long time. The words landed heavily between us. And I realized something that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just about today. Today was just the final display. The confirmation. The moment we were shown what had already been decided. We started walking again. Slowly. Away from the noise. Away from the music. Away from the version of the family we thought we had. And as we walked, I felt something new forming inside me. Not anger yet. Not action, but understanding. Cold, precise, undeniable. Helen spoke softly one last time. I don't think Daniel sees it, she said. I didn't respond immediately, because I wasn't sure anymore. Maybe he didn't, or maybe he had chosen not to. And that thought was the most painful realization of all. We reached the edge of the estate. Behind us, the wedding continued. But for us, something had already ended. Not the ceremony, not the event, but the illusion. And once that illusion breaks, you can never go back to the way things were before. We had barely reached the parking area when Helen stopped walking again. This time, it wasn't hesitation. It was shock. She stared at something ahead of us. I followed her gaze, and I saw him. Daniel, my son, standing near the entrance of the venue, talking to Samantha. They were not arguing. They were not emotional. They were calm. Too calm. Like two people finishing a discussion they had already rehearsed. Helen tightened her grip on my arm. Why is he there already? She whispered. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Or maybe I didn't want to know. We stood at a distance. Close enough to see. Far enough not to be seen. Samantha was speaking softly, her hands moving slightly as she talked. Daniel nodded once. Then twice. And then, he looked back toward the ceremony area. Not toward us. Toward the space we had just left. It felt deliberate. Like he was checking something. Or confirming it. Helen's voice was barely audible. I think he knew, she said. That sentence hit me harder than anything that day. Knew what? I asked. But even as I asked it, I already felt the answer forming. She turned to me. All of it, she said. The seating. The way we were treated. The way they excluded me. She paused. And he didn't stop it. I watched my son again, trying to find something familiar in him. But all I saw was distance. Not just physical distance. Emotional distance. The kind that doesn't happen suddenly. The kind that is built slowly. Over time. Without confrontation. Without explanation. Just acceptance. Samantha placed a hand lightly on Daniel's arm. It was a gesture that looked casual. But it wasn't. It was control disguised as comfort. And Daniel didn't move away. That was the moment something inside me changed. Not anger. Not sadness. But recognition. Helen spoke again, quieter this time. I remember now, she said. I looked at her. What do you mean? She hesitated, then spoke slowly. All those times I felt uncomfortable around her. I thought I was imagining it. She shook her head. But I wasn't. She told me about small moments I had dismissed. Samantha suggesting where Helen should sit during family dinners. Samantha correcting her tone when speaking. Samantha deciding which holidays were more appropriate for travel. At the time, I saw them as harmless opinions. Now I saw them as steps. Carefully placed steps. Leading somewhere. And suddenly, I understood something deeply uncomfortable. This didn't begin today. Not even at the wedding. It had started long before. In conversations I didn't pay attention to. In decisions I didn't question. In moments I assumed were minor. But were actually intentional. Helen exhaled slowly. I think she's been building a version of this family where I don't fit, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was steady. And that steadiness scared me more than emotion would have. Because it meant she had already accepted it. I looked back at Daniel one more time. He was laughing now. Softly. Briefly. Then turning away with Samantha toward the venue. And I realized something that tightened my chest. He wasn't being pulled into this. He was already inside it. We left the venue shortly after. No one stopped us. No one followed. No one asked if we were okay. It was as if our departure was expected. Even planned. And that thought stayed with me all the way to the car. Helen finally spoke as I started the engine. I don't think this was just a wedding, she said. I looked at her. What do you mean? She stared out the window. I think it was a display. A pause. To show us where we stand. I didn't respond immediately. Because deep down, I knew she was right. The seating. The comments. The separation. The silence. It had all been communication. Just not spoken. As we drove away, the estate disappeared behind us. But what didn't disappear was the feeling that something had been revealed. Not fully. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know this family was not what we believed it was. And this was only the beginning. The drive home was silent. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that presses against your chest. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Unfinished. Helen sat beside me, looking out the window the entire time. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her hands were still clenched tightly in her lap. I could tell she was replaying everything. So was I? Every glance. Every comment. Every seat placement. Every silence that had been carefully arranged like part of a script. And now, away from the crowd, it all looked different. Clearer, sharper, more intentional. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Helen stayed seated for a moment after I turned off the engine. "I don't want to go back there," she said quietly. I nodded slowly. "Neither do I." Another pause. Then she turned toward me. "What happens now?" That question hung in the air longer than I expected. Because for the first time that day, I didn't have an immediate answer. I looked at our house. Simple, quiet, familiar. And suddenly it felt like the only place that still belonged to us. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. No performances. No seating arrangements. No invisible rules about where someone belonged. Just home. "I don't know yet," I said finally. But even as I said it, something inside me was shifting. Slowly, firmly, like a decision forming without permission. Helen nodded, but I saw it in her eyes. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was preparing. We stepped out of the car. The evening air was cooler now. Still. And for the first time since the wedding began, I felt something return. Not peace. Not anger. But clarity. The kind that arrives after denial finally breaks. Helen walked toward the front door, then stopped. She turned back to me. "Do you think Daniel knows what he's doing?" she asked. I didn't answer immediately, because I had asked myself that question too many times today, and every answer hurt in a different way. "Finally," I said, "I think he knows more than he's saying." She closed her eyes briefly, as if that confirmed something she had been afraid to believe. We went inside, but nothing felt the same. Not the walls, not the furniture, not even the air. Everything felt slightly distant, like the house was waiting for us to decide who we were now. Helen sat down slowly on the sofa. "I spent years trying to fit into that family," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried exhaustion underneath it. "I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, quiet enough," she shook her head, "it would eventually feel like I belonged." I sat beside her, and for the first time, I didn't interrupt, because I understood. That kind of hope doesn't disappear easily. It fades slowly, painfully. Through moments like today, Helen looked at me. "What do we do when a family decides we don't belong in it anymore?" she asked. I stayed silent for a moment. Then I said something I didn't fully understand yet myself. "We stop asking for permission to exist in it." A long silence followed. Not empty, but full. Full of everything we hadn't said at the wedding. Full of everything we had finally seen. Full of something that was no longer confusion, but direction. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something else. Something we had not yet named, but would soon be forced to confront. It was late that night when my phone rang. The sound broke the silence in a way that made both Helen and me freeze for a second. I looked at the screen. "Daniel." Helen saw it too. Neither of us spoke. The phone kept ringing. Once, twice, then stopped. A missed call. And then, almost immediately, a message appeared. "Dad, we need to talk." That was all it said. No explanation. No apology. Just that. Helen stood up slowly. "I don't think you should answer it," she said. I didn't reply right away, because I wasn't sure anymore what the right decision was. Not after everything we had just seen. Not after everything we had just realized. I sat there staring at the message. "Dad, we need to talk." But I already knew something had changed. This wasn't a casual message. It wasn't family conversation. It was reaction to something we hadn't fully seen yet. Or something we had seen, but not yet understood completely. Helen walked over and placed her hand gently on my shoulder. "I think this is going to get worse before it gets better," she said quietly. I nodded, because I felt the same. But deeper than that, I felt something else. Confirmation that the wedding wasn't the event. It was the surface. Something had been happening underneath it for a long time. And now it was starting to surface. I finally set the phone down without replying. Helen looked at me. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I took a slow breath. "I'm thinking about everything we ignored," I said. The comments we brushed off. The decisions we didn't question. The way things were slowly being arranged without us noticing. I paused, and I'm thinking none of it was random. Helen sat back down. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something quietly that stayed in the air longer than anything else that day. "If this was planned, then there's a reason." I turned to her. "What kind of reason?" She shook her head slightly. "I don't know yet. But people don't reorganize a family like that without one." That sentence changed the weight of everything. Because until that moment, I had been thinking about humiliation, about disrespect, about misunderstanding. But now, I was thinking about intent. I stood up and walked toward the window. Outside, the street was quiet. Normal. Ordinary. But nothing inside me felt ordinary anymore. I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit earlier. This wasn't just exclusion. It was positioning. And once someone positions you, it usually means they are preparing something else. Something final. Helen spoke softly behind me. "What will you do if he calls again?" she asked. I didn't turn around. "I will listen," I said. "And this time, I will pay attention to what is not being said." And in that moment, for the first time since the wedding began, I stopped feeling like someone who had been pushed out and started feeling like someone who had finally begun to see the whole picture, even if I didn't yet know what the picture was. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had slept well, but because I hadn't slept much at all. Helen was already in the kitchen when I came down. She was sitting quietly with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched yet. Her eyes were focused on something far beyond the window. She didn't turn when I entered. "I didn't sleep," she said softly. "Neither did I," I replied. And that was enough. No explanations. No need. We both understood why. The house felt different in daylight. Less heavy, but not lighter. More like something paused, waiting for what came next. I sat across from Helen. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she pushed her phone slightly toward me. "It rang again this morning," she said. I looked at it. One missed call. Daniel. Again. No message this time. Just silence after the attempt. That silence said more than words. Helen finally broke it. "I keep thinking about something," she said. I waited. Her fingers traced the edge of the cup slowly. If this was only about seeding or embarrassment, he wouldn't be calling like this. I looked at her. "What do you think it is then?" She hesitated, then said something I didn't expect. "I think something is at risk." That sentence changed the air instantly. "Risk?" I repeated. Helen nodded slowly. "Money. Control. Something legal, something structural." I frowned. "That's a serious assumption." "I know," she said quietly. "But think about it." Her voice steadied. The way everything was organized. The way decisions were already made before we even arrived. The way Samantha controlled space, placement, even conversation. She looked up at me. "That doesn't feel like family behavior. It feels like management." I didn't respond immediately, because part of me had already started forming the same thought, just in a quieter voice, one I had not wanted to listen to. Helen stood up and walked to the window. "I'm not scared anymore," she said. That surprised me, so I looked at her. "Why?" She turned back slowly. "Because now I understand something." Her voice was calm. Too calm. When people go to this much effort to move you, it means you are standing in the way of something. Those words settled heavily between us. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't replaying humiliation. I was replaying structure, patterns, decisions, timing. And I realized something I hadn't seen before. We were not randomly excluded. We were being repositioned. My phone vibrated again. This time, it wasn't Daniel. It was an unknown number. I stared at it for a moment. Helen noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. But I didn't ignore it. I unlocked the screen. A single message. "Don't trust what you think you saw at the wedding." No name. No signature. Just that. Helen stepped closer. "Who is it from?" she asked. I shook my head slowly. "I don't know." But something inside me tightened. Because now the silence had changed shape. It wasn't empty anymore. It was intentional. Helen looked at the message again. Her voice dropped. So it wasn't just us noticing. That was the moment everything shifted again. Because it confirmed something worse. Someone else saw it too. Someone else understood. And now, the story was no longer just about us. It was about what had been hidden from more than just two people. I placed the phone face down on the table. And for the first time, I said something I didn't know I was ready to say. "We need to understand what's really going on." Helen nodded. Not afraid. Not hesitant. Ready. And outside, the morning continued like nothing had happened. But inside that house, something irreversible had already begun. The message stayed on my phone longer than it should have. "Don't trust what you think you saw at the wedding." Helen kept looking at it in silence. Then she finally said, "That means someone knows exactly what happened." I nodded. But neither of us expected what came next. My phone rang again. This time, I answered. Helen straightened immediately, watching me closely. "Hello," I said. There was a pause. Then a woman's voice. Careful. Low. Almost hesitant. "Mr. Carter. I don't know if you remember me." Something in her tone made me sit up straighter. I'm listening, I replied. Another pause. Then she said, I worked at the venue yesterday. Helen leaned closer instantly. The woman continued. I shouldn't be calling, she said. But what happened at the wedding, it wasn't normal. My grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? I asked. Her voice dropped even further. The seating arrangements, the instructions we were given, they were very specific. She hesitated. And your wife? She wasn't supposed to be treated that way in front of guests. Helen's expression changed immediately. Who gave those instructions? I asked. Silence. Then, the woman said. One of the bridesmaids. But she said it came directly from the bride. Helen exhaled sharply. I could feel her reaction before I even looked at her. This was planned, she whispered. Not a question, a realization. The woman on the phone continued quickly now, as if she was afraid to stop talking. I saw the list. Seating charts, placement notes, even camera directions. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just social behavior, she said. It was arranged. Then she added something that froze me completely. And your son signed off on part of it. Silence. Not just on the phone. In the room. In my chest. In everything. Helen stepped back slightly. No, she said quietly. That can't be right. But I didn't answer. Because I wasn't sure anymore. The woman's voice softened. I thought you should know, she said. Because it didn't feel right. Then she hung up. I lowered the phone slowly. Helen was staring at me. What did she say? She asked. I hesitated. Then told her everything. When I finished, Helen didn't speak for a long time. Then she sat down slowly. So it wasn't just Samantha, she said. I nodded. It was organized, I added. And Daniel was part of it. That last sentence felt heavier than anything before. Not accusation, but confirmation of something neither of us wanted to accept. Helen looked down at her hands. I keep thinking about something, she said quietly. When a family changes how they treat you so suddenly, it's never sudden. She looked up. It's planned over time. And for the first time since the wedding, I felt something shift again. Not confusion, not shock, but direction. Because now we had something we didn't have before. A witness, a structure, and a name attached to the silence. I stood up. Helen looked at me. Where are you going? She asked. I paused, then said, I think it's time we stop guessing. I didn't speak for a long time after the call ended. Neither did Helen. The house felt different again. But this time, it wasn't confusion or uncertainty. It was weight. The kind of weight that comes when truth starts forming into something you can no longer avoid. Helen finally broke the silence. So it's confirmed, she said quietly. He knew. I didn't correct her. Because there was nothing left to correct. Only to understand. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water I didn't drink. My hands were steady, but my thoughts weren't. Every memory from the wedding replayed again. But now, they weren't fragments of confusion. They were pieces of structure, placement, timing, control, and above all, intent. Helen stood beside the table. What do we do now? She asked again. But this time, the question didn't feel uncertain. It felt final, like we had reached a point where silence was no longer neutral. It was acceptance. I looked at her, and I realized something simple. We had been reacting since yesterday. Confused, hurt, searching for meaning. But now we had something new. Direction. Not revenge. Not emotion. But clarity. We stopped waiting for explanations, I said. Helen watched me closely. We already have enough information to know this wasn't random. She nodded slowly. So what are you saying? I took a breath. We go back to the source. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. Daniel, she said. I nodded. Saying his name out loud felt different now. He wasn't just my son. Not in this moment. He was part of something I no longer understood. Something structured. Something deliberate. Helen sat down again. I keep thinking about something she said. She whispered. Samantha. I waited. She said logistics. Like we were objects being placed. I nodded. That's exactly what it was. A long silence followed. Then Helen looked at me. Do you think we were ever meant to feel welcome there? The question hit deeper than anything before. Because it forced me to admit something I had avoided all day. No, I said quietly. I don't think we were. Helen exhaled slowly. Not in sadness, but in release. Like something inside her had finally stopped resisting. Reality. I stood up. This doesn't end with us walking away, I said. Helen looked up. What do you mean? I met her eyes. If there was planning, there is documentation. And if there is documentation, I paused. Then there is truth we haven't seen yet. Helen slowly stood up too. And for the first time since the wedding, she didn't look lost. She looked focused. Then we find it, she said. And in that moment, the silence in the house changed again. This time, it wasn't heavy. It was ready. Helen was the one who brought me the old folder. It had been sitting in the bottom drawer of my desk for years, behind tax records, insurance papers, and warranty booklets for appliances we no longer owned. She placed it on the kitchen table without saying a word. I looked at it. The leather edges were cracked. The brass clasp had turned dull with age. Inside were documents I had not looked at in a long time. Property records, trust papers, copies of business agreements, and the original family estate plan I had created 15 years earlier, back when Daniel was still unmarried and still called us every Sunday night. Helen sat across from me. You said if there was planning, there would be documents, she said. I nodded slowly. Then I opened the folder. For several minutes, the only sound in the kitchen was paper moving against paper. Page after page, signature after signature, old decisions, old promises, old trust. And then I saw it. The wedding gift document. I had forgotten the exact wording, but not the purpose. Years ago, I had set aside a substantial amount of money for Daniel's future, part of it for a home, part of it for his marriage, and part of it to protect him in case life ever turned hard. But there was one condition, a simple one. The money was not to be released fully until after the wedding, and only if both Helen and I approved the final transfer. Helen leaned closer. What is it? I turned the page toward her. Her eyes moved across the paragraph, then stopped. She looked up at me. So they still need your approval? Our approval, I said. The room went completely still. And suddenly, every strange thing from the wedding became clearer. The seating, the humiliation, the pressure, the attempt to make Helen feel small enough to disappear. They were not only pushing us out emotionally, they were trying to weaken our position before the money moved. Helen covered her mouth with one hand. Oh my God, she whispered. I didn't say anything. Because for the first time, I understood the shape of the game. And I also understood why Daniel had called twice. Why Samantha had watched us so carefully. Why the venue staff had been instructed to control. Where Helen stood, where she sat, where she appeared in photographs. They needed us present enough to make the wedding look whole, but powerless enough not to interfere. I reached for my phone. Helen looked at me. Who are you calling? I didn't hesitate. Richard Wells. Her eyes widened slightly. Our lawyer. The same man who had written the trust. The same man who had once told me, never signed anything emotional. Families become most dangerous when money is dressed up as love. I found his number and pressed call. He answered on the third ring. Frank, he said. Everything all right? I looked at Helen. Her face was pale, but steady. No, I said calmly. Everything is not all right. There was a pause. Then Richard's voice changed. What happened? I took a slow breath. My son got married yesterday, I said. And before the cake was even cut, I think we discovered why they really needed us there. Silence. Then Richard said only one sentence. Don't sign anything. Don't approve anything. I'll be at your house in an hour. I ended the call. Helen stared at me. For the first time since the wedding, I saw something return to her eyes. Not happiness. Not relief. Power. Quiet power. The kind that had been buried under years of patience. She looked down at the folder, then back at me. So what happens now? I closed the folder slowly. Now, I said, we stop letting them decide where we stand. Richard arrived 57 minutes later. He didn't knock. He never did when things were serious. Helen opened the door, and I saw it immediately in his face. The shift from routine professionalism to controlled urgency. Show me everything, he said simply. We sat at the kitchen table again. But this time, the atmosphere was different. Not confusion, not shock, but alignment. Helen placed the folder in front of him. Richard opened it carefully, scanning page after page. The room stayed silent except for the sound of paper turning. Then he stopped. This is still active, he said. I nodded. And they know it. I added. Richard leaned back slightly. Then what you witnessed at the wedding wasn't emotional manipulation alone, he said. It was leverage positioning. Helen frowned. Leverage. Richard looked at both of us. They needed you present. Controlled. Emotionally destabilized, but legally intact. He paused. And they needed your approval window open. The words settled heavily in the room. Everything suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. The seating, the humiliation, the pressure on Helen. The way Samantha orchestrated distance without confrontation. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was preparation. Richard closed the folder. Here's what happens now, he said. They will contact you again. Likely through Daniel. Possibly within hours. He looked at me directly. And when they do, you say nothing emotional. Nothing vague. Only one message. Helen leaned forward. What message? Richard didn't hesitate. Everything goes through legal review. From now on. That night, Daniel called again. I let it ring. Then I watched the screen go dark. And for the first time, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. Not because I had lost my son, but because I finally understood what I had almost lost without realizing it. Control. Respect. Position. A week later, everything changed. Meetings were scheduled. Documents were reviewed. Words like trust structure and conditional approval filled conversations that used to be family dinners. Daniel stopped calling. Samantha stopped appearing in any communication. And slowly, the noise that had surrounded us began to fade. One evening, Helen stood by the window again. But this time, she was smiling faintly. I used to think family meant being included, she said softly. I walked beside her. And now, she looked at me. Now I think it means being respected, even when you say no. I nodded. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Outside, the world continued as usual. But inside our home, something had returned. Not the illusion of family, but something stronger. Truth. And sometimes, I still think about that wedding. Not the flowers. Not the music. But the silence before everything changed. Because that silence was not empty. It was a warning. And this time, we finally heard it.